As we come to the book of Genesis, with so many of the most well-known narratives in Jewish history, Western history, there's a temptation to accept the stories as they are presented to us. It's human nature to do so, but also human nature to have curiosity as to how those stories came to be. So I'd like to share with you this morning something a touch different, to talk about a story that many of you know very well, and look a little bit about the backstory as to how the version that we are accustomed to sat in its original format. And I want to pay homage and thanks to Elias Smith, a reporter for The Forward. It starts in an alley. An angsty gang creeps on stage in a stylized prologue showing the restlessness of the youths. It is New York City in the 1950s, and as the plot progresses, warring ethnic groups articulate their frustrations via song and dance. Children die tragic and preventable deaths. Everyone sings. The audience thinks soberly about prejudice and peace. This was the first treatment for a musical that was called originally, in its working title, Gang Bang. And it will, of course, eventually become one of the most popular musicals of all time, known by a much sleeker name. But for now, it was just a fuzzy sketch of an unwritten production about two gangs, one Gentile and Italian, and one Jewish. Before Leonard Bernstein composed any music, before Jerome Robbins choreographed a step, before Arthur Lawrence completed a single draft of the full book, before Stephen Sondheim, may he rest in peace, was even on the team, before West Side Story became the production it is, this group of all Jewish men initially conceived of a musical that meditated on religious intolerance, specifically centered around anti-Semitism. Couldn't have been more topical. The Jewish version of West Side Story, which someone told me was originally called East Side Story, but I can't find any backup for that. It didn't get very far. By the time the first draft of the musical was complete, the Jewish characters had become Puerto Rican. But evidence remains in the form of anecdotes and some treatments, scene-by-scene summaries of the action, including suggestions for some song, dance, character, and style choices. These documents are apparently readily available at the New York Public Library. The original version showed this Italian Romeo and a Jewish Juliet meeting at a street festival. It's Easter and Passover, Lawrence wrote, holiday time when the boys were free and had too much free time on their hands. As in the original Shakespeare, the teenagers do not initially recognize the threat presented by the other's background because religion, like family names and unlike race, is not always visually apparent. The innocence of the initial meeting ended when the lovers each learn the other belongs to an enemy clan. Unlike Maria, who has lived, we think, permanently in the eponymous West Side, Jewish Juliet has just traveled to the Lower East Side to join her family for Passover. She is not a regular dweller on the Lower East Side. The creators apparently planned to make Juliet a Holocaust survivor, perhaps haunted by the atrocities of a genocidal war. But she remains somehow able to believe that despite the sectarian violence affecting her community, her romance will succeed. The most conspicuously Jewish segment in the original story was a Passover Seder, set early in the show's final act. By that time, the second draft of the musical was in progress. It was mercifully entitled by that time Romeo instead of Gang Bang, but the holiday was the setting for a turbulent musical scene. Romeo, having killed a Tybalt in a previous scene, is on the run. The action cuts between the Seder and Romeo's flight from the police. As the scene reached the climax, biblical high drama was to undergird the intensity of the onstage action. The Jewish family, unaware that their son, Tybalt, had died, discusses the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. Romeo hides while the Capulets searched for matzah, an activity that was to be gay and joyous and done with much laughter and squealing. And as the jubilation was to reach its peak, the police were going to enter to announce Tybalt's murder. Perhaps the concept for the musical was too embryonic, or perhaps the choice to make the musical religious meant it would inevitably evoke the melodrama of faith in a way that the creators seem to indicate they thought might have been a little hokey. In either case, that scene seemed destined for a kind of bathos, an anticlimax, or even going from the sublime to the ridiculous. In subsequent scenes, the fighting was to escalate. Both gangs were to seek vengeance, show prejudice, trade insults, some of which I won't repeat here on Shabbat. And there was a character to be called Tanta, Shakespeare's nurse, and the lovely reporter says, mush the word around in your mouth enough, Tanta, Tanta, it kind of comes Anita over time if you mix up the letters a little bit. So that may be from where we got Anita. She attempts to interfere with the lethal trajectory of the story, and the Italian gang members finally confront her about her being Jewish. By the end of the original concept of the musical, both lovers, like in Shakespeare's original, were to die. The lights were to dim, the scenery would disappear except for the palette with the two lovers, and they thought maybe it would take place on Easter Sunday and they could have church bells ringing. And then, on second thought, Arthur Lawrence wrote, that might be a little bit too much. We wonder what West Side Story might have been if it had stayed with its original Jewish plot. This was utterly new to me, learning about this week. Would have been really interesting given that all of the original creators, of course, were Jewish, and that's been pointed out a number of times, that the transition to Puerto Rican and non-Jewish Americans, as it were, or European boys, doesn't quite work. And we're still wrestling with that. For people who have seen the brand new movie, it's still, as gorgeous as West Side Story is, there are pieces that don't quite fit in it. And I wonder, if I have my eyes open for this the first time, maybe that has something to do with it. That it just ultimately, the attempt at cultural, we call it now appropriation, didn't quite work fully, as magnificent as it is. One mention I'll make of another part of the show that they played with was the character of Doc, who originally in the, quote, religious version was described as having no religion. And somehow that made him like above it all. Without descending to religious conflict, he kind of floated above it all. As the show morphed and changed, Doc is described as being possibly Jewish. As somehow by the mid-century, in 20th century America, being Jewish was kind of a mediating position. You were not white enough to be considered white and not ethnic enough to be considered persecuted. Why is that utterly not different from this exact moment in time? Right? But that's how the Doc character evolved. Interesting to think about that at this time. And of course, going back to, I understand, in the current version, where Rita Moreno, who is ageless apparently, God bless her, to 120, plays Doc's widow in a new character, which is also marvelous because she herself would have crossed lines, as it were, for her romance. Really, really fascinating. So here we have it. West Side Story's original Jewish soul, which has certainly always been evident there, and now I know why, not just because of the creators, but because apparently that was how the story began. There is a very kind of Peshat reading of why West Side Story didn't stay a Jewish story, and that's one suggestion is because the creators noticed, or that they abandoned the plot when they realized that, of course, A.B.'s Irish Rose, a play from the 1920s, had dealt very similarly with Jewish-Gentile intermarriage. Either way, it's fascinating to me to think of the stages that a creative project goes through. And for those who embrace a documentary approach to reading our Torah, of course, these stories as well that are so beloved to us probably went through multiple versions and multiple drafts as well. Interesting to think about peering behind the curtain, so to speak, to think about what laid there. But because it is very much part of my life and duty to think about how all of this ties into our sacred scriptural readings for the day. Here at the end of the book of Genesis, it's so heartbreaking to me to see how parenting, or the lack thereof, or poor parenting, plays into the book of Genesis. Over and over again, as Rabbi Finley teaches, these characters in our sacred narrative seem to be grasping for blessings that they don't get. Confused blessings, misplaced blessings, stolen blessings, blessings that aren't really blessings. And in that regard, there's that moment in West Side Story that as a parent always hurts me. And maybe that's why, as much as I love West Side Story, it always pains me to engage too closely with it. And I think that's that moment in G. Officer Krupke, which is always done as a sort of comic relief almost, but it's so sad to me, the way the boys at the heart of the song say, "Gee, Officer Krupke, what's really hurting us," I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the lyrics in front of me, but what they say is, what we're missing is good parenting. I'm depraved on account of I'm deprived. And that always hurts me so much, because what they're really saying is we don't have anyone, at least in their adolescent minds, who loves us enough to keep us out of trouble. And that piece of West Side Story always goes right to my heart. These are listless youths with too much time on their hands and not enough good parenting, or not enough parenting at all, at home. Rabbi Finley calls the book of Genesis, as a subtitle, "The Struggle for the Blessing." What West Side Story, in whatever version it finally comes to us, teaches us, and what the book of Genesis teaches us too, is that without proper loving blessings from generation to generation, we just don't stand a chance. So this week and all the weeks going forward, especially this time of year and with all the difficulties that our society and world faces, someone in our lives needs a blessing. Some young person needs good parenting. Some broken heart needs healing. Can we do just a little something to bring about that kind of healing and that kind of blessing in our beautiful and broken world? Shabbat Shalom.